The November rain pelted against the fogged-up windows of the subway as Aminata Diallo pulled her soaked jacket tighter around herself. The fluorescent lights of Berlin's U8 subway line flickered rhythmically, casting harsh shadows on the few passengers still traveling at this late hour. It was shortly after midnight on a Tuesday, and the city seemed to be caught in a state between wakefulness and sleep. Aminata was 22 years old, born in Dakar, Senegal, raised between two worlds, two languages, two identities that never quite fit together. 4 years ago, she had come to Germany on a scholarship to study social work at Alice Salomon University. Her mother had cried at the airport in Dakar, held her hands, and prayed in Wolof that Allah would protect her in this foreign country. Aminata had promised to come back, promised to be successful, promised to make her family proud. Now she sat in an almost empty subway car, her eyes heavy after a double shift at the nursing home in Neukölln, where she worked alongside her studies to pay the rent for her tiny room in a 4-person shared apartment in Wedding. The scholarship covered her tuition, but Berlin had become expensive, especially for someone without family support in the country. Her cell phone showed 3 missed calls from her mother, but it was too late to call back. She would call tomorrow morning before class and hear the reassuring voice that had given her stability since childhood. The subway stopped at Gesundbrunnen station. Aminata looked up and noticed a man getting on and sitting down near her, even though the car was almost empty. He was in his mid-40s, she guessed, heavily built with a shaved head and tattoos creeping up his neck. His eyes scrutinized her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She knew that look. She had seen it often enough in her 4 years in Germany, that look that reduced her to her skin color, to prejudices, to fantasies she had not chosen. Aminata stood up, even though her stop was still 2 stops away, and moved toward the door. Better safe than sorry, her roommate Jasmine had often told her. The man also stood up. Her heartbeat quickened. The doors opened at Pankstrasse station and she got off, her steps quickening on the wet platform. It was a small station, poorly lit, with only a few people. The man followed her. She tried to convince herself that it was paranoia, that not every man who looked at her was a threat, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She quickened her pace toward the exit, her fingers already on her cell phone, ready to dial the emergency number. Then she saw the second man. He stood at the foot of the stairs, blocking her way, smiling with an expression that made her blood run cold. Younger than the first, slim, with cold blue eyes and a scar running across his left cheek. Aminata turned to look for another exit, but the first man had already closed the distance between them. She opened her mouth to scream, but a hand pressed brutally over her lips, while an arm wrapped around her waist and lifted her off her feet. The stench of sweat and alcohol filled her nose. She kicked and tried to bite, but his grip was iron. The second man was already with them, holding something in his hand, a cloth that smelled of chemicals. Panic exploded in her head. She knew what this meant. Stories of missing women, of human trafficking, of bodies found months later in parks. This couldn't happen, not to her, not now. She had plans, had a future, had a family waiting for her. The chemical smell intensified as the cloth was pressed against her face. She held her breath, fighting with desperate strength, but her lungs burned, demanding oxygen. When she finally had to inhale, her head filled with a sweet, suffocating fog. The world blurred. The lights of the subway station became blurry streaks. The sounds receded, as if she were being pulled underwater. The last thing she perceived before darkness engulfed her was the feeling of being thrown into a vehicle, the engine starting, and the cruel certainty that her life had just changed forever. When Aminata awoke, her first thought was that she was dreaming, a nightmare from which she would soon wake up in her small room in Wedding, with the sound of the tram outside and the smell of Jasmine's homemade bread from the kitchen. But the stabbing pain in her head, the burning in her throat, and the icy cold that permeated her body were too real. She opened her eyes slowly, squinting against the bright light of a bare light bulb dangling from the ceiling. The room was small, perhaps 3 by 4 meters, with damp concrete walls and no windows. The floor was cold and dirty, covered with stains whose origin she did not want to identify. In one corner stood a rusty metal bucket. The stench of mold, urine, and something sweet and rotten she couldn't name made her stomach rebel. She tried to sit up, and only then noticed the heavy chains that were fastened around her ankles and attached to a metal ring in the wall. The chains were long enough to move around the room, but not long enough to reach the heavy metal door, which seemed to be the only exit. Terror flooded her with such force that she couldn't breathe for a moment. This was real. This was really happening. She was trapped, somewhere, didn't know where, didn't know by whom, only knew that she was in mortal danger. She tugged at the chains, the metal rings cutting into her skin, but they were solid, professionally attached. Despair turned to panic. She screamed until her voice broke, screamed until her throat was raw, but no one came. Or worse, no one cared. After minutes, or perhaps hours, she had lost all sense of time. The door opened with a metallic screech. The man with the shaved head entered, followed by the younger man with the scar. Behind them came 2 other men she hadn't seen before. One was older, in his late 50s perhaps, with grey hair and glasses that gave him an almost intellectual appearance. The other was massive, over 100 kilograms of muscle, with dead eyes that showed no emotion. The bald man spoke first. His voice was rough, with an Eastern European accent that Aminata couldn't quite place. "Welcome to your new home, sweetheart. You'll be staying here for a while, so you'd better get used to it." Aminata tried to control her voice. "Let me go. I haven't done anything. My family will look for me. The police will look for me." The man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Your family's in Africa, right? And the police," he spat the word as if it were poisonous, "they don't care about missing foreigners. Do you think you're the first? You're number 12 this year. And do you know how many of the others were found? 0. He let the word hang in the air, letting it sink into Aminata's consciousness like lead in water. The older man with the glasses stepped closer, looking at her with the detached interest of a buyer at a market. "Not bad," he said with a northern German accent, "refined, almost bourgeois. Young, attractive, exotic. The customers will be satisfied." Aminata's stomach churned as the meaning of his words sank in. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to them. No, that can't be." The scarred man grinned, revealing yellow, rotten teeth. "Oh yes, sweetheart, that's exactly what it is. You belong to us now, and tonight your training begins." The burly man had been silent until now. Now he spoke in a surprisingly high voice that didn't match his body. "The boss says we can have her first, before the customers come, to break her." Aminata felt her body begin to tremble uncontrollably, as if the temperature in the room had suddenly dropped below freezing. She knew what was coming. She had read reports in her studies about human trafficking, about forced prostitution, about the systematic destruction of personality and will. But reading about it and experiencing it were 2 completely different universes. The bald man pulled a knife from his belt, a long curved thing with a blade that glinted in the light of the bulb. "We can make this easy or hard," he said, his voice now soft, almost gentle, which made it even more threatening. "Easy means you cooperate. Hard means," he pointed the knife at her body, "we take what we want and you suffer. Your choice." Aminata closed her eyes. In that moment, in that ice-cold hell without hope, she made a decision. She would survive. Whatever it took, she would survive this night. And if she survived, she would find a way to escape, a way to get revenge, a way to destroy these monsters who thought they could treat people like merchandise. She opened her eyes and looked directly at each of the 4 men, memorizing every detail. Their faces, their voices, their movements. She would remember everything. The night that followed was a journey through the darkest depths of human cruelty. Aminata forced her mind to distance itself, to separate from her body, to flee to a place where she was safe, where no one could reach her. It was a survival technique she had learned in her psychology class. Dissociation, a protective mechanism of the psyche against unbearable trauma. She let it happen, let her mind fly away while her body remained, while these monsters did what they did. But even in this dissociated state, part of her remained alert, observing, gathering information. She noticed that the bald man, whom the others called Victor, had a scar on his right hand. The scarred one, Dmitri, limped slightly on his left leg. The older man with glasses, whom they called Professor, wore a wedding ring and had photos of children in his wallet, which slipped out of his jacket pocket. The massive one, whom they simply called Animal, had problems with his right eye, blinking constantly as if he couldn't see properly. Details, weaknesses, opportunities. Her mind continued to work even as her body screamed. She would need this information, later, when the moment came. Towards morning, as the first rays of grey light penetrated through a tiny crack in the ceiling she hadn't noticed before, the men finally let her go. They thought she was broken, destroyed, ready to function as they wanted her to. They now lay there, exhausted from their deeds, asleep or semi-conscious from the alcohol and drugs they had consumed during the night. Victor snored loudly in a corner. Dmitri had gone outside, presumably to smoke. The professor had fallen asleep with his head on a dirty pillow. Only the Animal was still awake, sitting with his back to the wall, but his eyes were closing, heavy with fatigue. Aminata lay motionless, breathing shallowly, playing the broken doll. But her mind was crystal clear, sharper than ever. She had a plan. It was risky, almost certain to fail, but it was her only chance. The chains on her feet were secured with a padlock, heavy but not impossible to open if she had the right tool. Her eyes scanned the room methodically. There, near the door, lay Dmitri's jacket. She had seen a metallic glint in the pocket when he took it off. Maybe a lockpick, maybe just a key. It was 5 meters away. The chains reached 4 meters. She moved slowly, inch by inch, every movement controlled so as not to make a sound. The Animal had its eyes closed, its breathing deep and regular. She stretched as far as the chains would allow, her fingers reaching for the jacket. Too far. Another 30 centimeters. She looked for something she could use to pull the jacket toward her. There, a piece of wire protruding from the wall. She pulled it out carefully and bent it into a hook. Her heart was pounding so loudly that she was sure it would give her away. With trembling hands, she stretched out the wire, hooked it into the jacket, and pulled carefully. The jacket moved, centimeter by centimeter. The Animal stirred, muttering something incomprehensible. Aminata froze, barely breathing. Seconds stretched into eternities. Then his head fell back to the side, back into deep sleep. She pulled further. The jacket came closer, closer. Finally, it was within reach. She reached inside, her fingers groping for metal. There, a bunch of keys. 3 keys of different sizes. One of them had to fit. With hands sweaty with fear, she tried the first key. Too big. The second, too small. The third, it fit. The lock opened with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She waited, holding her breath. No one moved. The chains fell from her ankles. She was free, at least from the chains. Now came the difficult part. Aminata slowly stood up, her legs trembling with pain and exhaustion. She was naked, vulnerable against 4 men, but she had the advantage of surprise, and she had nothing left to lose. Her gaze fell on the knife Victor had laid down beside him. 7 meters away. She crept toward it, each step a torment, each movement a risk. The Animal opened one eye, saw her, understood what was happening. He moved to get up, to scream, but Aminata was faster. Adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she had. She lunged for the knife, grabbed it, spun around. The animal was on his feet, his massive hand reaching for her. She stabbed. Once, twice, 3 times. The blade sank deep into his neck, between his ribs, into his stomach. Warm blood spurted over her hands, her chest, her face. He gasped, tried to scream, but only a gurgling sound came out of his mouth. He fell heavily to the floor, his massive body shaking the room. Victor woke up disoriented, trying to understand what was happening. Aminata was already with him, the bloody knife in her hand. She didn't hesitate. This was no longer self-defense. This was revenge. Pure, unfiltered revenge for everything they had done to her, for every humiliation, every pain, every moment of terror. She killed him while he was still trying to collect his thoughts, quickly, efficiently, without mercy. The professor woke up and screamed, a high-pitched, horrified scream. Aminata turned to him. She saw pure terror in his eyes. Good. He should be afraid. He should feel what she had felt. She walked slowly toward him, the knife dripping blood onto the dirty floor. "Please," he stammered, "I have a family, children." She thought of the photos in his wallet, of the children who had a monster for a father. "I had a family too," she said quietly. "Can you continue? Shall I move on to chapter 2? The blade descended with a precision that surprised even Aminata. The professor tried to defend himself, his hands reaching for the knife, but she was stronger, driven by something primitive that she couldn't or didn't want to control. His blood mixed with that of the others on the concrete floor, forming dark puddles that reflected the faint morning light. When it was over, Aminata stood amid the corpses, the knife still in her trembling hand. Her entire body was covered in blood, her own skin barely recognizable beneath the red mask. She was breathing heavily, gasping as if she had run a marathon. 3 men dead, but Dmitri was still missing. He had gone outside. He would come back. She moved quickly now, driven by adrenaline and the certainty that she didn't have much time. She found a cell phone in Victor's pants pocket, locked, useless. In the professor's jacket, she found a wallet with €200, credit cards, and a car key. She took everything. The big guy only had cigarettes and a half-full bottle of liquor with him. Aminata searched desperately for clothes. Her own things were gone, presumably burned or disposed of. In a corner, she found an old tracksuit, much too big, that reeked of sweat and diesel. She put it on, her hands leaving bloody marks on the grey fabric. She couldn't find any shoes, but in another corner there was a pair of worn sneakers, size 40 at least, but better than bare feet. The door to the basement room was open. Behind it, a narrow concrete staircase led upstairs. Aminata gripped the knife more tightly and climbed the steps, each movement painful, her body protesting against the abuse of the previous night. At the top, she found herself in an abandoned industrial building, broken windows, rusty machines, walls covered with graffiti. The sweet smell of rotting wood and stagnant water hung in the air. Through a broken window, she saw Dmitri. He was standing about 20 meters away, leaning against an old delivery van, smoking and staring at his phone. He had no idea what had happened in the basement. Aminata watched him through the dirty glass. She could try to sneak out, could try to escape before he came back, but then he would find the bodies. He would alert others. He would hunt her down. No. She had to end it, here and now. All 4 of them had to die for her to have a chance. Aminata crept through the destroyed building, using the shadows and the tangled mess of rubbish and old furniture as cover. Dmitri had his back to her, completely relaxed, unaware. She got closer, 10 meters, 5 meters, 3 meters. A piece of glass crunched under her shoe. Dmitri spun around, his hand automatically reaching for the gun in his belt. But Aminata was faster. She lunged at him with the desperate strength of a hunted animal. The knife found its target once, twice, again and again. She couldn't stop, even when he was already dead, even when her arm ached and her lungs gasped for air. Finally, she dropped the knife. It clattered onto the asphalt next to Dimitri's lifeless body. 4 men, all dead, by her hand. Aminata sank to her knees, clutching her stomach and vomiting violently. The shock, the exhaustion, the sheer magnitude of what she had done overwhelmed her. She had killed, not once, but 4 times. She had become a murderer, the executioner of her tormentors. She forced herself to get up, to move. She could break down later. She could process it later. Right now she had to survive. She searched Dimitri's pockets, found his cell phone unlocked and more cash, and a car key that must have belonged to the delivery van. She opened the driver's door. The keys were still in the ignition. Typical carelessness. Before she drove off, she looked around, trying to understand where she was. The industrial area was deserted, obviously abandoned for years. In the distance, she could see the skyline of a city. But which one? Berlin. Another city. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, how far they had been transported. The GPS in the delivery van showed a location in Brandenburg, about 60 kilometers southeast of Berlin. A perfect place to hold people captive, far away from prying eyes. Aminata started the engine with trembling hands. She could barely drive, having had only a few hours of practice with a friend, never having gotten a driver's license. But now was not the time for second thoughts. The van jerked forward as she struggled with the clutch and gear shift. Slowly, bumpily, she drove across the destroyed terrain to the main road. Her mind was racing. She had to go to the police. She had to report what had happened. But at the same time, she knew how it would look. A black migrant, covered in the blood of 4 white men, with a story of kidnapping and rape that was impossible to prove because she had killed all the witnesses. Would anyone believe her? Or would they treat her like a murderer, a criminal? The cell phone in her bag vibrated. Dimitri's phone. A message had come in. She stopped at a deserted gas station and opened the phone. The message was in Russian, but she could understand enough to grasp the content. Someone was asking if the goods were ready for transport that evening, if everything was going according to plan. Aminata stared at the screen, and suddenly the full extent of the situation dawned on her. This had not been an isolated incident. It was organized. These 4 men were part of something bigger, a network that kidnapped and sold women. The goods mentioned in the message were her, and how many others before her? How many after her if this network was not stopped? She scrolled through Dimitri's contacts, through his messages, names, addresses, meeting places. An entire organization revealed itself before her eyes. And then she found something that took her breath away. Photos. Dozens of photos of young women, most of them dark-skinned, most of them migrants. Some were dated and located. Some were marked sold or disappeared. Aminata recognized a face. Fatou, a friend from Senegal who had come to Germany 2 years ago and suddenly disappeared 6 months ago. Everyone had assumed she had gone back to Africa. But here was her photo, marked "Sold to Dubai, March." Aminata felt anger welling up in her chest, hot and destructive. At that moment she made her decision. She would not go to the police, not right away. First, she would destroy this network from within, using the information she now possessed. She would find every member and bring them to justice. Not through the law, which had failed, but through her own justice. She had already taken 4 lives. What were a few more if it meant saving dozens of others? The sun was now higher in the sky, dispelling the last shadows of the night. Aminata drove on toward Berlin, her mind already making plans, her determination harder than steel. Berlin welcomed Aminata with its chaotic morning traffic and the indifferent anonymity of millions of people. She parked the van in a deserted backyard in Marzahn, hastily wiping her fingerprints from all surfaces and leaving the vehicle. Her oversized shoes shuffled with every step. The blood-stained tracksuit attracted a few glances, but no one stopped her. In this city, misery was invisible. With the stolen money, she bought new clothes, a cheap handbag, and a baseball cap at a thrift store. In the public restroom of a shopping mall, she washed the blood from her skin as best she could, the cold water turning pink in the sink. Her reflection frightened her. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, bruises on her neck. She looked like a ghost. Aminata knew she couldn't return to her shared apartment. Too risky. Instead, she rented a cheap room in a rundown hostel in Kreuzberg, paid in cash, no questions asked. The owner, an elderly Turkish man with cloudy eyes, looked her over briefly, then nodded and gave her a key to room 7. There, in the stuffy confines with peeling wallpaper and the smell of disinfectant, she methodically spread out the contents of Dimitri's phone. She photographed every chat, every address, every name with her own cell phone, which, strangely enough, had remained intact in her handbag, which she later found in the delivery van. The network was frighteningly extensive. 15 active members in Berlin alone, contacts in Hamburg, Munich, Cologne, connections to buyers in Dubai, Istanbul, Riyadh. The women were systematically hunted, broken, and sold like cattle. A perfectly oiled system that had been operating for years. One name appeared repeatedly, Mr. Winter. No photo, just a contact, but from the messages it was clear that he was the head of the organization. He decided who was taken, who was sold where, who lived, and who disappeared. The 4 men she had killed had only been executors, foot soldiers in a larger war. Aminata's fingers hovered over the phone. She could call the police now, hand everything over, have the network broken up. But a bitter taste filled her mouth at the thought. How long would it take? How many women would disappear in the meantime? How many would survive the bureaucratic juggernaut? No. She had chosen a more direct route, and there was no turning back. In Dimitri's calendar, she found an entry for tonight. Meeting, North Warehouse. Discuss new delivery. 6 p.m. Aminata checked the address. An industrial area in Reinickendorf, isolated, perfect for illegal business, perfect also for what she had in mind. She opened her handbag and looked at the knife she had brought with her. The blade had been wiped clean, but she could still see the blood on it, burned into her memory. She had already taken 4 lives. Tonight there would be more. The hours until 6 p.m. passed agonizingly slowly. Aminata forced herself to eat something, even though every bite tasted like ashes. She had to be strong for what was to come. In the hostel room, she prepared herself like a soldier before battle. She sharpened the knife on the rough windowsill. She tore strips from a bedsheet and wrapped them around her hands for a better grip. At 5 p.m., she set off. The subway was crowded with commuters on their way home, no one paying attention to the young woman with the baseball cap pulled low over her face. She got off in Reinickendorf and walked the last 2 kilometers. The industrial area was quiet, deserted, with only a few trucks passing by. The warehouse was a 3-story concrete block with boarded-up windows and graffiti on the walls. A black Mercedes was already parked in front of it, engine off. Aminata hid behind a container 50 meters away and watched. Shortly after 6 p.m., 2 more vehicles arrived. Men got out, 5 in total, all powerfully built, all with the aura of people accustomed to violence. They waited. After 10 minutes, the warehouse door opened from the inside. A figure stepped out, tall, wearing a coat despite the mild temperature, his face in shadow. The men bowed slightly. Mr. Winter. It had to be him. His voice was soft but authoritative. Even from a distance, Aminata could sense the power he exuded. "Where are Victor and the others?" he asked with a northern German accent. "Unreachable, Mr. Winter," one of the men replied nervously. A pause. Then, "I don't like that. Go check. Immediately." Two men nodded and drove away. Aminata knew she had only a few hours before the bodies would be discovered. She had to act now. Her original plan had been to wait, observe, and return later. But now, with Mr. Winter right in front of her, she knew this was her only chance. She crept closer, using the darkness and the containers as cover. The three remaining men stood by the cars, smoking and talking quietly. Mr. Winter had gone back into the hall. Aminata took a deep breath, then moved, quickly, silently, the knife clenched tightly in her hand. The first man noticed her too late. The blade cut his throat before he could scream. The second turned around, his hand reaching for his gun, but Aminata was faster, driven by desperation and adrenaline. Two men dead in seconds. The third managed to scream, "Alarm! Attack!" Mr. Winter appeared in the doorway, a pistol already in his hand. His eyes widened when he saw Aminata covered in blood, like a vengeful spirit from a nightmare. "You," he whispered in disbelief, "you should be dead." "Your 4 dogs are dead," Aminata said in a voice she didn't recognize. "Now it's your turn." The shot rang out through the night. Pain exploded in Aminata's left shoulder, throwing her back against the container. The bullet had hit her, but not fatally. The adrenaline rush meant she hardly felt anything. Mr. Winter took aim again, his hand steady, professional. But Aminata was already moving, rolling behind the container as a second bullet struck the metal, sending sparks flying. "You stupid girl!" Mr. Winter shouted. "Do you really think you can kill us all? We are legion. You are nothing." The third man who had shouted came at her with an iron bar. Aminata waited until he was close enough, then thrust the knife upward between his ribs. He fell to the ground, gurgling. The iron bar rolled out of his hand. She grabbed it. Mr. Winter fired again, but Aminata had become faster, driven by something superhuman. The bullet narrowly missed her. She threw the iron bar with all her might. It hit Mr. Winter on the wrist, and the gun flew through the air and landed several meters away. For a moment, they stared at each other, both unarmed now, both injured. Then they lunged at each other. Mr. Winter was bigger, stronger, more athletic. But Aminata had nothing left to lose. She fought like a wild animal, scratching, biting, hitting. Her fingers found his eyes and squeezed. He screamed and threw her off him. She landed hard, her injured shoulder screaming in pain. Mr. Winter staggered toward the gun, blood running down his face. Aminata crawled toward the knife, sticking out of the third man, and pulled it out. They reached for their weapons at the same time. Mr. Winter turned around and raised the gun. Aminata threw the knife with her last ounce of strength. It spun through the air, a deadly spiral, and hit him squarely in the chest. Mr. Winter froze, staring in disbelief at the handle protruding from his chest. The gun fell from his hand. He sank to his knees, then forward, his face hitting the asphalt. Aminata lay there gasping, unable to move. Blood seeped from her shoulder, forming a dark puddle. 4 bodies lay around her. Silence descended on the industrial area. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone must have reported the shots. With her last ounce of strength, she crawled over to Mr. Winter and turned him over. He was still alive, barely. His lips moved. "Why?" he whispered, blood spilling from his mouth. "Fatu," Aminata said softly. "And all the others whose names I don't know. This is for them." She watched as the life drained from his eyes. Then she pulled out Dimitri's phone and dialed 110. When the voice answered, she said with surprising calm, "I'm in Reinickendorf, Industriegebiet Nord. There are 4 dead, and I have evidence of a human trafficking network. Come quickly. I'm injured." Then she put the phone down beside her and waited for the police, for the consequences, for whatever would come next. The first police cars arrived within 7 minutes, their blue lights transforming the nighttime scene into a surreal spectacle. Aminata lay motionless among the bodies, the phone still in her bloody hand. She had no strength left to flee, no strength left to fight. Her exhaustion was total, absolute. Her consciousness flickered like a dying candle. Voices, footsteps. Someone knelt beside her. "We have a survivor. Paramedics now!" A warm blanket was placed over her trembling body. Strong hands examined her wound and applied a pressure bandage. "Stay with us. You can do this." The voice belonged to a young police officer, barely older than herself, whose eyes reflected horror and compassion. The ambulances arrived. Paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher. As she was carried away, Aminata saw the police officers cordoning off the scene, examining the bodies. She heard their muffled conversations. 8 dead in total, if you count the ones in the basement. Who is this girl? How could one person have done all this? At Charité Hospital, she was taken straight to the operating room. The bullet had not hit any vital organs, but it had caused significant tissue damage. While the doctors worked, 2 police officers stood guard outside the door. She was both a victim and a suspect. When Aminata woke up hours later, she found herself in a sterile single room, chained to the bed. Next to her sat a woman in civilian clothes, in her late 40s, with short grey hair and intelligent eyes behind rimless glasses. "Miss Diallo," she said calmly. "I'm Chief Inspector Sabine Richter from the Homicide Division. Can you talk to me?" Aminata nodded weakly. Her throat was as dry as desert sand. Richter handed her a glass of water and waited patiently while she drank. Then the inspector took out a recording device. "I must inform you that you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used in court." "I know," Aminata whispered, "but I want to talk. I want the truth to come out." Over the next 3 hours, she told everything about her abduction in the subway, the night in the basement, the rape by 4 men, her desperate escape, the murders. She described the phone, the photos, the network. Richter interrupted her only rarely, asking precise questions and taking notes. Her face remained professionally neutral, but Aminata saw the anger flashing in her eyes. "The phone," Richter finally said. "Where is it now?" "In my bag. At the hostel in Kreuzberg, room 7. Aminata gave her the address. Richter immediately sent a team. 2 hours later, they returned with the phone and all the evidence Aminata had collected. The cyber department immediately began analyzing it. What they found confirmed Aminata's story in terrifying detail. Hundreds of messages, photos of victims, transaction logs, names of buyers and sellers, an entire criminal empire documented in digital bytes. The story broke 2 days later. A journalist from the Berliner Zeitung, Marie Fischer, had learned about the case from sources in the police. Her article carried the headline, "Kidnapped, Raped, Turned into a Murderer, a Student's Desperate Revenge." The text described Aminata's ordeal and her deadly retribution with unflinching honesty. The public reaction was explosive. Feminist groups organized vigils in front of the hospital, demanding Aminata's release. "She is not a monster, she is a survivor," read the posters. At the same time, conservative voices called for harsh punishment. "No one is above the law. 8 murders remain 8 murders." Social media exploded with the hashtag Justice for Aminata. Thousands shared their own stories of sexual violence, of a system that had failed them. Others warned against vigilante justice, against a society in which anyone could play judge and executioner. Political pressure grew. Berlin's interior senator had to take a stand. "This case reveals systemic failures in our fight against human trafficking. We will conduct a full investigation." The public prosecutor's office faced a dilemma. Technically, Aminata had killed 8 people, Only the first 4 in the basement could possibly be considered self-defense. The 4 at the warehouse were more difficult to justify. 3 weeks after her arrest, the first hearing took place. The courtroom was crowded with journalists, activists, and onlookers. Aminata sat between her 2 court-appointed lawyers, wearing a simple grey suit provided by an aid organization. She looked small, fragile, hardly capable of the crimes she was accused of. The prosecutor, Dr. Schneider, an experienced lawyer with cold blue eyes, presented the case. Aminata Diallo killed 8 people. 4 of these killings may have been in self-defense. However, the other 4 were planned, premeditated murders. She had time to escape, to go to the police. Instead, she chose revenge. That is not self-defense, that is murder. Aminata's lead defense attorney, Thomas Bergen, a man in his mid-50s with the charisma of a crusader, delivered an impassioned defense speech. My client was kidnapped, tortured, raped. She escaped from a hell that no one in this courtroom can imagine. Yes, she killed her tormentors. But she did more than that. She uncovered a huge criminal network that had been operating for years. Without her courage, dozens more women would have disappeared today. He presented the evidence to the court. The photos of the missing women, the sales records, the international connections. Thanks to Aminata Diallo's actions, 12 other members of this network have already been arrested. 15 women have been freed from forced prostitution. If that doesn't count as a mitigating circumstance, then I don't know what should. The trial dragged on for months. Psychiatrists were called in as expert witnesses. They diagnosed Aminata with post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociative states during the killings. A psychologist explained, Ms. Diallo acted in a state of extreme psychological distress. Her survival instinct took control. What looks like cold calculation was in fact a traumatic reaction. The jury was divided. After 5 days of deliberation, they reached a verdict that did not really satisfy anyone. Aminata was found guilty of 4 counts of murder, but with significantly mitigating circumstances. The sentence was 7 years imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 4 years. When the verdict was announced, turmoil broke out in the courtroom. Some cheered, others protested loudly. Aminata herself showed no reaction. She sat quietly, tears running down her cheeks, but she was not crying out of relief or despair. She was crying for everything that was lost. Her innocence, her future, the women like Fatou whom she could not save. On each anniversary of her conviction, people gathered with candles outside the prison in Pankow, where Aminata was to serve her sentence. She became a symbol, controversial and complex. To some, she was a heroine, a woman who took the law into her own hands when the system failed. To others, she was a murderer who set a dangerous precedent. In her cell, Aminata wrote letters to the families of the men she had killed. Not all of them replied. Some cursed her, but one woman, Victor's sister, wrote back, I loved my brother, but I knew he was a monster. Maybe it's better this way. After 3 years in prison, Aminata received a visit from Marie Fisher, the journalist who had first told her story. I'm writing a book, Marie said, about you, about the network, about all the women who disappeared. Would you help me? Aminata thought for a long time, then she nodded. Yes. But tell the whole truth, not just my story. Tell about Fatou, about all the others. They deserve to be remembered. The book was published a year later under the title Chains of Revenge, One Woman Against the System. It became a bestseller, reigniting debates about self-defense, justice, and the limits of the rule of law. Aminata donated all of the proceeds to organizations that support victims of human trafficking. After 4 years and 2 months, Aminata was released early on parole for good behavior and her contribution to exposing the criminal network. When she walked through the prison doors into freedom, There were no cameras, no crowds waiting for her, only her mother, who had come from Senegal, and her former roommate, Jasmine. They hugged each other for a long time, without words. Aminata was now 27 years old. She had spent her youth in captivity, first in the hell of that night, then behind bars. But she was alive, and somewhere out there were the women who had been saved by her actions. She would never again be who she once was. That Aminata had died in that basement, but perhaps, she thought as she walked through the streets of Berlin with her mother, she could become something new. Not a heroine, not a murderer. Just a survivor trying to live with the shadows that would accompany her forever.